I'm Ed Adams, and this is the weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. I will never forget standing on the Waterfront Park Pier in Charleston, South Carolina, not far from where the brig Chichester would have come to port on Christmas Day in 1767. Looking out to Patriots Point and further on down towards Sullivan's Island, I remember thinking that it felt surreal to be looking out at more or less the same sights that my seventh great-grandfather, Samuel Proctor, saw as he stepped off the boat into what was for him the New World. In my mind's eye, I could see Charleston as it was then. A British flag flying over the south end near the Battery, tall steepled churches speckling the skyline. That, of course, is still actually easy to imagine in Charleston. It's known today as the Holy City because of how many churches are in the downtown area. I imagined what his thoughts were as he and his two brothers and their families disembarked after the quarantine. I thought about the stress of finding accommodation for your family as you're awaiting your chance to file your petition for a land grant. And then naturally my mind shifted to the incredible journey inland as they made their way from the relatively settled coast out to the lawless and completely untamed backcountry. A few days later, I took the easy drive up I-26 through Columbia and up to Newberry. There wasn't much to see but pine trees and highway, but I imagined how challenging it would have been to navigate this land via dirt road. And once I got past Columbia, I thought about some of the horrendous violence between the American colonists and the Cherokee and whether or not Samuel fully understood what he was getting his family into. For a while, it's almost as if I thought, once we arrived in Newberry, I was going to be transported back in time. I was going to see an old inn and people running around in tricorn hats. Instead, once we pulled into town, I recall there was a Zaxby's Chicken and an Econo Lodge. My wife, then girlfriend, was with me at the time, and we pulled into a small diner along the town square and had brunch while I tried to put together a plan of action for the day. Yeah, you heard that right. I put together my plan for my first genealogy road trip after arriving at my destination. Traveling can be an amazing part of your family history journey. It's hard to describe the feelings that you get when you find yourself standing in the same space that your ancestors walked. For a moment, the only thing that separates you from those who came before you is time. It really helps to get into a better headspace for understanding these people, and some of my best stories have come from genealogy road trips. Unfortunately, like everything else in life, there's lots of mistakes that you can make that might end up keeping you from maximizing the benefit of the trip, and even worse, could ruin the trip for you. Let's start with the plan. Don't be like me and just head off into the backwoods of South Carolina without a plan. I mean, there's some fun to be had by approaching things with a spirit of spontaneity, but understand that you do so at your own risk and at the risk of missing out on some great stuff. How much time you need to prepare for your road trip will depend on a number of things. How much time do you have to dedicate to the trip? Is it really a road trip, or are you flying? Is it a there and back, or is this an overnight? Do you require special accommodations? Do you speak the language? The list can go on, but you probably get the point. Some big things to consider. How much time do you have to dedicate to the trip? I feel like I never have enough time to do everything I want to do on a trip, but over the years, I think I've gotten more realistic with regards to what I can get accomplished in a certain amount of time. If it's just a drive-by along a route that you're traveling for work or for a family vacation, you may only have an hour or two, and you really need to look at what your high payoff target is. Now, what's high payoff for you will depend on your goal. Are you looking for an experience? Then maybe all you want to focus on is driving out to your family's property so that you can see the sights, hear the sounds, and even smell the smells. There's nothing wrong with this as a goal, so don't short yourself if this is what you're really looking for. You don't need to also swing by the probate office to justify the stop. Make sure you get the one thing done that you really want to get done, so if you can never get back to this place, you at least did that one big thing. If you're not looking for the experience, then part of your planning needs to be reviewing the various record collections available at the courthouse, the probate office, library, or whatever other repository might be in town. Keeping in mind that if the place you want to go to isn't the county seat, then you'll need to add that place to your itinerary as well. Again, the Family Search Wiki is a great resource to figure out what might be available in a physical repository. I've always been pleasantly surprised with how most small-town public employees are willing to talk to you over the phone about what they have available. I think sometimes they just think it's neat that someone's interested in their small town and they want to make sure that you get everything that you're looking for out of the visit. So don't just roll up sight unseen. Sometimes, and I emphasize sometimes, these people will even do a bit of research for you ahead of time and might have some stuff waiting for you. But it's a big time saver if when you show up on the front doorstep of the clerk of the court, you can just say, "Hey, remember me? I talked to you on the phone the other day about looking at deeds." 2 minutes later, you're going to be looking at the deeds that you wanted to look at, rather than having a lengthy conversation or having to endure the tour of the archives. While your family is at a local diner having a lunch break, you could be adding some vital sources to your family records. If you're not super pressed on time, you should still look at prioritizing all the things that you want to see, and do them roughly in that order. You'll probably need to adjust the order based off of specific location or operating hours, but it's so easy to lose track of time when you're digging into things that you've been dreaming about getting your hands on. You don't want to kick yourself when you realize that you've run out of time and have left off some of the things that you really wanted to do. Speaking of operating hours, it's really important that researching these is a part of your trip planning. In smaller towns and counties, it's very common for public offices to keep strange hours. Maybe they aren't open at all on Mondays, or if they are, maybe they close at noon. Don't trust the hours posted on Google listings. Check the websites for the location if available, or just call and ask. Think about whether you're going to be crossing a time zone to get to your destination. It may seem obvious that you need to factor that in, but I've driven some fairly short distances to go see things that I forgot were in a different time zone and didn't realize until I got there and now had one less hour than I'd planned. Back onto the topic of planning. A big thing for me as I go on road trips is experiential. Sure, I love digging into sources that aren't available online, but I also want to have the experience of seeing physical places that are important. This often requires gaining access to land that isn't just on the side of the road, and you may not even be able to drive there effectively. So do some research before going. Hopefully you already know where your ancestors' significant places were, but what does that mean for today? Who owns them, and how can you get permission to go out there? My best recommendation is the tax assessor's website for the county the property is in. I've never come across a county that doesn't have an online geographic information system, or GIS. Think of it as Google Maps, but for land ownership. You can cross-reference your deeds with plat maps or whatever other collection of sources tell you where your ancestors' property was, and then find it on the GIS. It may still be intact, or it may be part of multiple plots today. Just click on those areas that are pertinent, and you can usually find the name of the current owner and some contact information, although the contact information is usually just a mailing address, so this bit of planning needs to be done well in advance. If all you can get is a name, then you can often just do a simple Google search and find their phone number or the phone number of relatives or neighbors. I don't really have the bandwidth in this episode to go in depth on how to do that, but it's really not all that complicated. It just takes time. I make sure to do a good map reconnaissance of the areas that I want to see and get a sense for the kind of terrain that I'm going to have to deal with, and that will help me make decisions about what clothes to pack and, in particular, which shoes to wear on the day that I plan to go out and see the property. If you can, talk to the landowner about particular hazards that might be out there, as you can find yourself in some fairly rough country on some of these trips. Snakes, bears, and other things you'd prefer not to come across can be a reality depending on where you're wanting to go. One of the last things I'll talk about in the planning phase only matters if you're bringing family along with you. If your family is like mine and not as interested in this whole endeavor as you are, you need to spend some time planning fun things for them to do and see. That'll either provide you with the time that you need to go research or see the things that you want to see, or it will at least placate them a bit if you can't split up. Because you really don't want the eye rolls when you're up to your armpits in documents in an old courthouse archive. I would like to say for the record, though, that while my wife is really not into genealogy at all like I am, she is the world's best travel partner, and she has spent many hours walking around town squares or looking at old paintings in courthouses while I do my work. She's really the best. Moving on to the actual trip. My number one recommendation while you're actually on the ground is to be friendly and talk to as many people as are willing to talk to you. You'll pick up tons of local color this way, And don't be surprised if you get lucky and find someone who knows the guy who owns the bit of property that you never got permission for. Sometimes having someone vouch for you can get you a long way and find you gaining access to places that you never would have gotten to on your own. When you're doing research on site, you're likely to find things that you simply can't find online. You may find things that no one else who is working that family line has ever seen. You're going to probably find a moment where you're going to want to sit down, break out your laptop, and start analyzing things. I may do this for a few minutes, but I really resist the urge to go all the way down the rabbit hole because I can do that in the comfort of my own home. I can't access the Talbot County Pistol Toters Registry from my home, though, so while I'm on the ground, I want to do all those things that I can only do there. So switch yourself into collection mode and just take notes, make copies, take photos. Be sure to note where you got all the things that you're copying and photographing, though, because you don't want to get back home and look at that photo of an old document and not remember what collection that came from. Speaking of copies and photos, it's becoming less common, but I have been to some places that don't let you take photos of the records, but require you to use their copier to make copies, which of course they charge you for, and they won't take credit cards. So make sure to have some cash on you. I'd like to end the episode with a quick story from my most recent genealogy road trip. The story actually starts about 8 years ago when I first went to Talbot County, Georgia. I had as a goal setting foot on the former property of the first Adams of my line to be born in the New World. I had a halfway decent idea of where the property was based on an old county history titled A Rockaway in Talbot by William Davidson. Now, when I say I had a halfway decent idea, what I mean is the book didn't have a map or anything near that useful, but it did have a description of how you used to be able to get out to the old property back around the turn of the century. The directions were based on things like, turning left when you see the yellow dog sitting by the old oak tree. I exaggerate, of course, but after a while of cross-referencing the directions with Google Maps, I think I had a pretty good idea of where to start looking. So I packed up the truck and hit the road. When I got into town, I started investigating the area that matched up with the directions in the book. Sure enough, on the ground, the directions actually seemed to match even better. I started to see those oak trees and those yellow dogs, and before you knew it, I was deep in the South Georgia woods on a very narrow dirt road. After passing a few homes that had been almost entirely reclaimed by nature, I finally came to the end of the directions, which put me smack dab on the doorstep of a fairly nice-looking property that looked as if someone surely still lived there. There were a number of prominently displayed keep-out signs along the fence line that bordered the property, so I decided not to hop the fence and go knock on their front door, but instead just hollered from the fence line. No one responded. I was disappointed, but honestly, I was just excited to be standing there, looking at that land where my fifth great-grandfather lived. It was a pretty amazing experience. After that, I backtracked into town and did some good documentary research in the courthouse, where I found a number of good things. All in all, I saw it as a successful trip. 7 or so years later, my dad had come to visit, and I wanted to take him out to Talbot County to see the property. He was up for the road trip, so we headed out. I hadn't really expected to be able to see much more than I already had, but I knew my dad would get a kick out of it. Sure enough, we made our way out to the property, and it looked pretty much the same as it had many years prior. I hollered, but no one responded. After a while, we shrugged, got back in the truck, and started to head back into town. Just down the road, on the way back into town, there was about a 100-year-old home set up on a slight hill. As we passed by, I noticed a woman out in the front yard with her kid, so I waved and, the windows were down, so I just offered a friendly howdy. She smiled and waved back. Maybe 100 feet later, something told me I needed to go back and talk to that woman. So I stopped and reversed the truck back down the road. She came down her lawn and came towards the truck, and I told her who I was and what I was doing and asked if she knew the people that owned the property down the way. She told me I should probably talk to her husband. So I shut the truck off and hopped out. As I was walking up to the yard, her husband came walking out of the house and onto the porch. I again explained to him who I was and that I was interested in looking around on that property next to them and wondered if he knew who I could get in touch with. He told me that the property belonged to his great-aunt and that she was out of town. He also added that he hunts out on that property from time to time, and there's a bunch of old tombstones near one of his favorite hunting spots. Naturally, my ears perked at that bit of news, and I asked him if he might be able to take me back out to that spot. He said sure, and the next thing you know, I'm out there in the thick, tick and snake-infested woods of southern Georgia in the middle of the summer. It was an adventure. But before long, we crested a hill into an area that had less undergrowth than anything else around it. And sure enough, leaning up against a tree was an old tombstone. After getting closer, I could make out the name of my fifth great-grandmother, Margaret Rudd Adams. Born 1783, died 1840. There was about a dozen other markers in the area, but they had all been destroyed by time and were completely unreadable. But I could tell that this was the old family cemetery. It was an incredible find. After taking some GPS coordinates, I thanked my guide and we all headed back. The drive back home was long and quiet. My dad and I were both trying to come to terms with what we'd actually seen. All because I stopped and said howdy. I hope you too are able to take your search for your family's history away from the computer screen and off into the old dusty dirt roads of the real world. But if you do, remember, make a plan first, and don't be afraid to say hello. If you have an interesting genealogy road trip story, I'd love to hear about it. Please reach out on Twitter at TheWGTPod. If you feel like something from today's episode will help you take that trip that you've always been wanting to take, think about leaving a review. Regardless, I just want to thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.